Ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name is Graham. We're back in X-Plane 10 with the IXEG 737-300. Today we're on the approach to Geneva Airport, Geneva runway 23, approaching over the lake. You can see the Alps out there to the south, Mont Blanc, looking along to the eastern end of Lake Geneva, and there's some terrain on the northern side of the airfield as well. In the past few videos, we've been looking at descent management and how to execute a manually flown go-around with the aircraft. I mentioned in that video I wasn't 100% sure whether the aircraft could do an auto-coupled missed approach, but it turns out yes, it actually can. So in this video, it's really quite close into the airport already. We're already set up for the approach. We'll have a look at the go-around using the autopilot and some more missed approach sequence stuff as well. One of the key things about Geneva is the missed approach. It basically flies straight ahead off the runway here, out to about 9 miles, turns left and then comes back up the lake towards Sompré where the arrival starts. If you've got both engines operating in a really good climb gradient, then there's no problems at all. If you're in a lower performance aircraft, or if you have an engine failure on the missed approach, then the missed approach turn can be in between these two hills here. So it's quite challenging. There's a speed restriction on the missed approach. What I'll do is I'll put a link to the charts in the video description. So as normal by now, you know the situation starts with the sim paused. The aircraft is already set up, the speeds are bugged. It's coming back to the approach speed of 128 knots. Flaps 3 for the landing. We've got the gear down, speed brakes armed, and the only thing that's a little bit unusual for my videos here is the pressurization is in standby. The only reason for that is because I've not done a full flight to get to this point. I've just more or less repositioned the aircraft to where you see it just now. The key things for the autopilot approach or the automatic landing is we've got to have the runway course or the ILS course in both of the course selectors here. We need to have the same frequency on both the nav aids, both the nav radios, have the flight directors on and the auto thrust armed. It's really quite straightforward. The missed approach is just a single click on this aircraft. We'll push the toga button, say go around flaps and select flaps 15. One of the things I've noticed when testing this out in the sim is I've been doing the go around about 50 feet radial, which would be the minimums that this aircraft could operate to. Every so often when I'm doing that, it's been capturing a flare mode and flying along with the thrust increasing. So I don't think that's quite right, but to avoid it being really an issue, I'm going to put an extra 10 feet onto the decision height, make it 60 feet, and it behaves quite consistently and reliably in this mode. So without further ado, I'll release the pause and we'll set off towards Geneva. So we're just approaching 1500 feet above the runway. I've got both autopilots selected, but it's still saying single channel. When I go through 1500 feet, it should go to 2 channel. You see the indicators flash briefly, and you'll see the flare mode is indicated armed under the GS if everything's correct. There we go. So it's now both channels running and it's got the flare mode armed as well. So we're correctly set up for an automatic approach. Bug speeds I discussed in the previous video, but this is the VAP speed here, plus 15 and 170 for the first retraction and 190 for flap 0. You see these power lines here. In real life in Geneva, I believe there are some much lower level power lines on the undershoot of the runway. X-Plane seems to model them as 100-foot tall pylons. I've looked at the settings to see if I can remove them, but they are still here. We'll just skim right over the top of them. But in real life, you'd be nowhere near as close to the pylons as this. 1,000. So through 1,000 feet, I've got 3 greens here, green lights, speed brake armed, and everything else is set correctly. I mentioned the speed restriction in the turn as well. You'll see when I select flaps 15, the aircraft will drive the speed target up to the plus 15 here. And when I select flaps 5, it will come up to about 180 or so. That's going to work out really quite usefully for us in the missed approach. 500. So there's the pylons I talked about. You can see one dead center on the approach track here. Again, in real life, that would be a real problem for us, but not today. Not a sim issue.
200. 100. Minimum.
Go around, flat 15.
30, 20, 10.
Positive climb, gear up. You see the speed targets come up now, that's the plus 15 I mentioned. And as we're above 400 feet radial, I'll push heading select initially. So once we get to 1,000 feet above the field, I'll retract the flaps to flaps 5 and watch the speed target go up here. So flaps 5, speed target comes up to 180. At this point I need to reach in the nav aids, so 11575 for Geneva. It's the same radial, so I'll looks good. I'll put Vorlock in. It should capture in just a second. There we go, Vorlock. The Geneva VOR is in the undershoot of the runway, just like at Barcelona, so it's the same radial as the runway heading, which is really quite useful. And without retracting the flaps any further, I've got an appropriate speed target. 185 is the maximum in the turn, and we're going to turn at 9.5D from the GVA. So I don't need to clean up at all. I'll leave it at flaps 5, and that'll be perfectly adequate for the turn. While it's climbing, I'll show you that on the LNAV procedure, it shows it as a teardrop returning back up the approach track. That's actually not correct as far as the charts go, so we'll fly what the chart says. It's not unusual to have slightly inconsistent nav data in the FMC, but really you just do exactly what the chart says using the aircraft modes as required. You see it's got go around thrust, which is what it's holding, and the pitch mode is toga, so it's commanding the speed bug as I retract. So once we get to 9.5 DME, I'm going to start a turn to the left. What I can do, there it's just captured, it's gone into max speed, MCP speeds, and I'll acquire. It captures whatever speed I was flying at, so if I bump that up to 180 just to tidy it up. And what I'll do is I'll prepare the heading bug for that turn there. So what we're going to do is turn to intercept a radial off the Chambéry VOR. It's a radial 040 that takes us out towards Saint-Pré. I'd probably be asking the other pilots on the anti-ice on at this point, but there's our 9.5. I'll do the turn and retain Chambéry at 115.4 and course 040. While that's happening, just check the temperatures here. Yeah, outside temperatures +6, so what we'll do, make sure the ignition's on, turn on the engine anti-ice. +10 to -40 with anything above idle thrust set, and if you're idle thrust, anything below +10. So in the descent, have the anti-ice on if it's below +10. But in the climbing cruise, if the temperature is below -40, you can have the anti-ice off. So to pick up this radial, you can see the LNAV, it would be commanding this teardrop as I said, but we're going to pick up this radial and fly outbound on it. I'll intercept it using the heading mode just to try and keep life nice and simple here. And more or less on the track now, so I'll go to Vorlock. Hopefully it'll capture. There we go. and just make sure that it's going to turn in the correct sense. I want it to go to the left to track outbound towards Sombre. So the last thing I've got to do is on the other box I'll put 113.9, and that should be the DME out towards Sombre. We can verify it with the RMI here. It's pointing towards the single arrow is pointing back towards Chambéry, and the double arrow is pointing ahead to Sombre, and they're both more or less aligned, which means we're on a direct track between them. Now we're around the corner, I can increase speed firstly to 210 knots, and above 170, so I can go to flaps 1, and above 190 I can select flaps up. At this point we'd be looking at the fuel state. At the moment we've got 3 tons, which is quite comfortable, and discussing why we went around. More often than not, the reason you go around is maybe an aircraft ahead of you late to vacate the runway. It's quite uncommon to go around for weather minima, on the basis that if the minima is low, you do an automatic approach and landing. And it's not, even with something like the Cat 3A capability on this aircraft, it'd be very unlikely not to get in on most days. So now we've got flaps up with no lights. I can select the gear up and off, disarm the speed brake, and if it's appropriate, turn off the continuous ignition. Because we're kind of in icing conditions, off and on, I'll leave that selected just now, and make sure the auto brake's off. So you'll see on that approach and landing there, or approach and missed approach, we executed the go around at 60 feet radial, and the minimum altitude I saw on the radial was about 10 feet or so. So you can imagine if you did that from 50 feet, there's a distinct possibility of touching down. I think some aircraft types, it's quite common to touch down if you do a very low missed approach. I don't know whether that's the case for the 737 or not, but it's certainly not expected to be an unusual occurrence. Now we're tracking out over the lake towards Sombre. We can have another go and do the approach and landing, but it's very much the same as what you've seen in the previous videos. So at this point we've had a look at pretty much all that's required on the 737-300 to do a normal airline kind of flight from one destination to the other. We've shown a setup and departure. We've shown a standard arrival with a little bit of radar vectoring onto the ILS, both manual and automatic landings. We've looked at RNAV arrival. We've looked at visual circling. We've done some base training to help us get to the position where we can practice landings. And now we've also looked at descent management, manually flown missed approach, and automatic missed approach. Those are really all the building blocks you need on a day-to-day basis. So from now on we'll have a look at a couple of challenging approaches we could do with the aircraft. That's always the fun part of the job. So we'll have a look at maybe circling to Dubrovnik, runway 30, and then we'll maybe have a look at Innsbruck as well. The only thing that's holding me back from the Innsbruck videos is the nav aids on X-Plane at the moment. There's something a little bit unusual about how the VORs are aligned to magnetic north. I'm not 100% sure how it's doing it at the moment. I put a support request in with Laminar, so hopefully I'll get a little bit more information on what's going on there. But in the meantime, I'll continue to research the Innsbruck arrival and see if we can do something meaningful in the sim as well. As always, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it informative, and if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the video comments. Thanks for watching, and I hope to speak to you again soon.